Most men carry the same unspoken question: is there a size women actually prefer? Not the mythical one portrayed in adult media, not the exaggerated one men joke about, but the real measurement that aligns with female anatomy during sex. And here's the part no one expects: a very common range, one that countless men already fall into, turns out to be the one women consistently choose in controlled scientific studies. I'm Dr. Emily Collins, urologist. And from the start, let's be clear, this conversation is about sexual health. About how your body works, how women's bodies respond, and why certain dimensions, the ones men rarely think deeply about, create more comfort, pleasure, and confidence during intimate moments. What studies found is surprisingly simple: the most preferred size isn't an extreme. It isn't the outlier men imagine. It's a range that fits naturally within the typical depth and sensitivity of the vaginal canal. When a man's erection falls into this interval, movement tends to feel more fluid for both partners, contact with the most responsive areas becomes easier, and the overall experience is more balanced. Not too shallow, not too intense, just biomechanically harmonious. Most men don't realize this because their perception comes from culture, not anatomy. They compare themselves to unrealistic examples and assume women want something dramatically larger. But when scientists removed bias, using standardized models and anonymous evaluations, the same preference peak appeared over and over. Women chose what felt compatible with their bodies, not what looked impressive. And here's the twist: many men who fit this ideal have spent years feeling average simply because no one ever explained how female physiology actually works. If you're in that common interval, you may already offer exactly the combination of depth, stimulation, and comfort that women report as most satisfying. This video is not about reassurance, it's about evidence. You'll hear the real measurements, the anatomy behind them, and why extremes often reduce pleasure instead of enhancing it. Before we continue, check if you're already subscribed to the channel. And tell me in the comments, biology if you believe women choose based on anatomy, or myth if you think men judge themselves based on cultural illusions. When researchers decided to finally answer what size women actually prefer, they understood one thing clearly: this couldn't be based on opinions. Human memory is unreliable, comparisons are distorted, and cultural expectations shape perception more than experience. So instead of asking women abstract questions about sex, they built experiments designed to remove every layer of bias and reveal only what the body itself responds to. To do this, they created a series of anatomical models, identical in color, material, surface texture, and curvature, differing only in length and circumference by meticulously controlled increments. No labels, no measurements printed anywhere, no visual cues that could influence judgment. Participants touched and evaluated the models without knowing which size they were holding, allowing instinct and sensation to guide their choices rather than preconceived ideas. But physical models were just the beginning. Another group of researchers used advanced 3D software that allowed women to adjust dimensions with millimeter precision. In these digital tests, participants could expand, shrink, or fine-tune the shape in real time until they felt it matched their ideal experience during intercourse. This eliminated the influence of external comparison; everything was based on personal sensation and memory. What surprised the scientists wasn't that women had preferences; everyone expected that. What shocked them was how consistently their choices centered around the same interval. Even when the participants didn't know the measurements, even when they adjusted models blindly, even when the tests were repeated months later, the results converged again and again toward the same range. To ensure reliability, researchers also repeated the experiments with different age groups, relationship histories, and cultural backgrounds. The pattern remained stable. Whether a woman preferred slower, deeper movement or more rhythmic stimulation, the interval that balanced comfort and arousal almost always landed in the same place. This finding wasn't the result of psychological bias or social expectation; it was the result of anatomy. The female reproductive canal has dimensional limits, pressure-sensitive regions, and a natural depth where stimulation feels most harmonious. The sizes women chose aligned with these biological realities perfectly. If this kind of scientific clarity is helping you understand your own body better, tap the like button. It helps this information reach more men who've spent years hearing myths instead of data. When scientists examined the results of the experiments, the consistency was impossible to ignore. Women from different ages, backgrounds, and sexual histories repeatedly gravitated toward the same interval, a range that wasn't exaggerated, wasn't extreme, and wasn't shaped by fantasy. The preference emerged not from imagination, but from the natural structure of the female body during arousal. To understand why, researchers mapped the internal dimensions of the vaginal canal across various stages of stimulation. What they found was remarkable. Although the canal expands, elongates, and changes shape during arousal, it does so within predictable limits. There is an average depth where stimulation is most effective and an average boundary where discomfort begins. The preferred interval among women fit almost perfectly within that window. Female anatomy is not a straight tube. It has curves, pressure-sensitive areas, and regions where nerve density is significantly higher. When a man's erection falls within the preferred interval, several things happen at once. The anterior wall, one of the most responsive internal regions, is more easily stimulated. Movement becomes smoother because the penis can reach pleasurable depth without colliding with sensitive upper boundaries. And the rhythm of thrusting remains controlled and comfortable, allowing the body to maintain arousal instead of activating protective reflexes. In the studies, women also described this range as balanced. They weren't referring to appearance, they were referring to how it felt during sex: enough depth to create the sensation of fullness, enough reach to stimulate the most reactive tissues, but not so much that tension, guarding, or cervix contact disrupted the experience. The researchers even noted another pattern: women who initially imagined they preferred something larger often changed their minds once they handled the standardized models. They realized that what they remembered as pleasurable wasn't an extreme measurement, but a specific point where stimulation felt deep without being overwhelming. This peak of pleasure range wasn't discovered by chance. It reflected a precise intersection between male size and female anatomy, a biological harmony shaped by both structure and sensation. And once women evaluated the options without external influence, the same interval consistently emerged as the most satisfying. As researchers continued analyzing the data, another pattern emerged, one that challenges one of the most persistent myths in male sexuality. While many men assume that bigger is always better, women in the studies repeatedly revealed the opposite. Extremely large sizes didn't enhance pleasure, they disrupted it. And the reasons for this are deeply rooted in the mechanics of the female body. The vaginal canal, even at maximum arousal, has a limited depth. Beyond a certain point, increased length stops being stimulating and becomes intrusive. This isn't about preference or psychology, it's about anatomy. When penetration exceeds the comfortable range, the cervix becomes a point of contact. Unlike external tissues, the cervix isn't designed for impact. It contains fewer pleasure receptors and is connected to reflex pathways that trigger tension, guarding, and even pain. For many women, the moment this boundary is reached, arousal declines instantly. Researchers noticed a second issue: reduced mobility. When a penis is significantly longer than the canal's functional depth, the woman has less room for natural motion. Instead of fluid rhythm, the couple must adjust constantly to avoid hitting internal boundaries. This breaks the neurological cycle of arousal, which relies on consistency and repetitive stimulation of the same sensitive areas. Women in the studies described longer models with precise vocabulary, harder to control, too strong at certain angles, or requires constant adjustment. These weren't statements about attractiveness, they were simply observations about physical dynamics during sex. If the body perceives a threat of discomfort, even unconsciously, the pelvic floor tightens. Lubrication decreases. The internal muscles begin protecting instead of receiving. The entire process of pleasure collapses under the weight of biological self-preservation. There is also the emotional component. Many women reported feeling a subtle apprehension with larger-than-average partners, a sense that they needed to stay alert rather than relaxed. This anticipatory tension interferes directly with arousal, since the female orgasm relies on a cascade of neurological relaxation signals that cannot coexist with anxiety or caution. Finally, evolutionary perspectives reinforce the findings. Human reproduction historically favored compatibility, not extremes. Painful intercourse reduces frequency, bonding, and reproductive success. Over thousands of generations, preference drifted toward partners whose size allowed both stimulation and comfort. In this context, the paradox of size becomes clear: what appears advantageous from the outside becomes counterproductive inside the human body. Pleasure depends on alignment, not excess. And the sizes women avoid are often avoided not because they're impressive, but because they complicate the very mechanics that create satisfaction. As researchers continued dissecting the data, they uncovered a detail that reshaped the entire conversation: women weren't evaluating length alone. In many cases, length was simply a supporting factor. The variable that consistently influenced pleasure, often more strongly than any other, was girth. Unlike length, which interacts primarily with depth, girth determines how much contact occurs along the vaginal walls. These walls aren't just surfaces, they're densely layered with nerve endings, pressure-sensitive folds, and muscular ridges that respond directly to outward expansion. When a penis applies consistent lateral pressure, even modest increases can activate a completely different spectrum of sensations. In the tactile part of the studies, researchers noticed something intriguing. When presented with models of identical length but different girths, women often selected the thicker option even when it wasn't the longest. This wasn't an aesthetic reaction. It was a sensory one. The feeling of fullness, as many described it, had nothing to do with depth and everything to do with the extent of contact across internal surfaces. From a neurological standpoint, this makes perfect sense. The anterior vaginal wall, one of the most responsive regions, reacts strongly to uniform pressure. The pelvic floor muscles, which contribute to arousal and orgasm, contract rhythmically around stimulation that feels secure and steady. Girth enhances both of these mechanisms by increasing the surface area of stimulation. More contact means more friction. More friction means more sensory signals traveling to the brain. And the brain processes these signals as warmth, intensity, and heightened pleasure. But this doesn't mean thicker is always better. Just like excessive length disrupts depth, excessive girth disrupts balance. If the circumference stretches tissue beyond its natural comfort range, the body switches from receptive to protective mode. Lubrication decreases. The pelvic floor tightens. Pain replaces pleasure. The margin for enjoyable stimulation narrows drastically. What women actually preferred in the studies was a level of width that enhanced pressure without overwhelming the surrounding tissues. Another revealing detail emerged when scientists looked at how girth influenced movement. A penis with the right circumference stabilizes rhythmic motion, making angles more consistent and thrust patterns smoother. Women described this as predictable, steady, or easy to sync with, which directly supports arousal. Too little girth can feel unfocused. Too much can feel restrictive. The preferred size, the one that reappeared in study after study, struck a natural midpoint. What the research ultimately showed is that girth doesn't replace length, nor does length replace girth. They interact. They complement. And when both fall into the biologically compatible range, the experience becomes not just pleasurable, but instinctively satisfying. When the researchers shifted from anatomical data to psychological insight, an unexpected contradiction surfaced. Men and women were not only describing different preferences, they were living in completely different realities. Men consistently overestimated what women wanted, often imagining a size that belonged more in fantasy than in physiology. And what made this even more striking was how persistent this illusion was, regardless of age or experience. To understand the disconnect, scientists asked men to guess which dimensions women found most pleasurable before revealing any data. The results painted a clear picture. Almost every male participant assumed the ideal was significantly larger than what women actually chose. Many believed women preferred sizes that would, in biological terms, cause more discomfort than pleasure. This wasn't arrogance, it was cultural conditioning. A major source of the illusion is exposure to unrealistic representations of sex. Men grow up seeing exaggerated bodies presented as the norm, reinforcing the idea that bigger must equal better. Over time, these images aren't just comparisons, they become internal baselines. Even men who fall perfectly within the female preferred range often believe they are lacking simply because their perception has been shaped by artificial extremes. Another driving force behind the illusion is silence. Men rarely talk openly about sexual anatomy, and when they do, honesty is rare. Exaggerated claims become social currency. Jokes and competitive bravado distort the truth even further. Meanwhile, women, who actually experience the sensations, are seldom part of the conversation. The result is a feedback loop where men reinforce one another's insecurities without realizing they're comparing themselves to distorted expectations. The psychological consequences are profound. Men who are anatomically ideal often carry unnecessary anxiety, assuming they fall short. This anxiety doesn't stay in the mind, it follows them into the bedroom. It affects erection quality, confidence, rhythm, and connection. The irony is striking. Men who believe their average may actually provide the size women enjoy most, while men who believe they must be larger to satisfy often misunderstand the mechanics of female pleasure entirely. Researchers also found that women consistently described their best experiences not by size but by comfort, relaxation, communication, and the ability to maintain rhythm without tension. These qualities rely far more on confidence than on measurements. Yet confidence is the very thing the male illusion erodes. The illusion persists because men think women judge them the same way men judge themselves. They don't. Women evaluate sensation, harmony, and consistency, not spectacle. And when men finally see the real data, many realize that their biggest enemy was never their anatomy, but the false standard they carried for years. After the studies mapped out the preferred size range, researchers didn't stop there. They asked women a different question, one that men almost never consider: what actually makes an intimate experience unforgettable? The answers exposed a truth far more important than any measurement. Women repeatedly described pleasure not as a single physical element, but as an interaction of anatomy, rhythm, trust, and emotional comfort. Size was part of the equation, but it wasn't the deciding factor. In fact, many women said that even when a partner fit the ideal range, the experience only became exceptional when the man combined physical compatibility with confidence, patience, and awareness of their cues. From a physiological standpoint, this makes perfect sense. A woman's ability to reach deeper levels of arousal depends heavily on relaxation. When she feels safe, both physically and emotionally, the pelvic floor loosens, lubrication increases, and the internal tissues respond more intensely to stimulation. A man who is comfortable with his own body, regardless of size, is more likely to create this environment. Confidence stabilizes movement. Calmness improves rhythm. Awareness enhances timing. These are the elements that activate the neurological pathways tied to orgasm. Researchers also found another surprising pattern. Even women who initially believed size mattered more eventually ranked other factors higher. Communication, emotional connection, and the ability to adjust pressure and angle consistently outranked any anatomical measurement. Many women described partners slightly outside the ideal size range as more satisfying simply because those men were attentive, coordinated, or emotionally present. Evolutionary biology supports this as well. Successful mating, meaning not just reproduction, but bonding and long-term compatibility, has always relied on trust and cooperation. Physical extremes were never favored in nature, adaptability and sensitivity were. So the real takeaway is simple: size may influence the starting point, but your behavior determines the outcome. You may already fall within the preferred range without realizing it. And even if you don't, everything that amplifies pleasure remains entirely within your control. If this video helped you understand your own sexual health with more clarity, then don't let the conversation end here. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes, like this video, and explore the other content we've already posted. There's much more that can strengthen your confidence, your performance, and your understanding of what women actually feel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.